So, how many of us are familiar with the idea of the draft in professional sports? Oh, wow, quite a few of us. Okay, good, this will be easy. So just to kind of catch us all up together, the way the draft works is that when there's new young players coming out of high school or college, the draft is the way that players get assigned to teams. And generally in American sports, the way it works is the worst teams get the best draft picks so they have the opportunity to improve. Dan's Detroit Football Lions have been in this conundrum for a while with consistently building through the draft since they've been consistently bad. Although they were able to keep my mortal enemy, the Green Bay Packers, out of the playoffs this year. So I am a very happy camper as a Bears fan with all that they're accomplishing, and they're on the up and up. The Jacksonville Jaguars, same way. The last 2 years in a row, they've been the worst team in the NFL. So they got to pick first overall both years. And if you didn't catch it last night, you missed a great one where they have now not just made it to the playoffs and won their division, but they're advancing into the next round. And then there's my Chicago Bears, who are about to go through this phase of building through the draft. Please, Lord, give Justin some help. Amen. But they've lost a ton of games, but they've played really well, and they're about to be able to build through the draft with the number 1 overall pick. And in the early 2010s, the Philadelphia 76ers were an NBA team at a crossroads. See, the thing with building through the draft is, if you're really good, you don't get the great draft picks, right? That makes sense, you know? Just because you're good, you don't get the opportunity to build through the draft the same way other teams do. And if you're really bad, you get really great draft picks. But if you're in that middle spot where you're not good enough to make it through to the championship, but you're not bad enough to qualify for the number 1 pick, you just get stuck in this holding pattern, right, the whole time. Just ask Uriah about his Indianapolis Colts. And the Philadelphia 76ers in the early 2010s were at this point. They were in that middle no man's land. So in 2013, they hired their 3rd general manager in 3 years. His name was Sam Hinkie. Yes, you can laugh about the name, it's okay. But Hinkie's tenure as GM, when you look at the on-the-court results, was awful. They won, in his 3 years as GM, 23%, 22%, and then 12% of their games in those 3 seasons. That last one's just 10 wins across an 82-game season. So if you take like your 90s Bulls that you know and love, that had that really great 72-10 season, just flip that record around. As good as those Bulls were, that's how bad the 76ers were in 2015 to 2016. That's bad. And over that 3-year period, remember, 82-game seasons we're talking about here, they won just 47 games, just over a half season's worth of games. Now, I'm not going to make any excuses for that really bad stretch of basketball, because it was a really bad stretch of basketball. But behind the scenes, what Sam Hinkie was doing as general manager was something really, really cool. He was accumulating young players and future draft picks to build through the draft. From the 2014 to the 2014 NBA drafts, the 76ers had 6 different picks inside those top 10 draft slots across those 5 years. They drafted a 5-time All-Star center in Joel Embiid and a 3-time All-Star forward in Ben Simmons. And from 2017 to 2022, they've ended each season not just relevant, but actually succeeding in the postseason a little bit. They had at least 40 wins every year, and they made the playoffs every single one of those years. During Hinkie's tenure as GM from 2013 to 2016, he had this phrase that became a rallying cry for Philly sports fans following the Sixers. Trust the process. Trust the process. And this mantra he put into the minds of his front office, his coaching staff, and his players, because he wanted them to understand that it was going to be terrible for a little while, but it was going to get better eventually, and they were going to be a part of that process. And you can see here, like these are fans that were after Hinkie had left. I don't know how many fans know the name of their GM, but that's pretty cool. In Hinkie we trust. You know, it's sometimes difficult to trust the process. It's sometimes difficult to see the road ahead. Because when we're in life and we have a rough time, especially such a continued bad stretch like the Sixers had, we often can't see a way out. And we know that there's a process going on. It's really easy for us to tell each other and to tell ourselves, so I'm going to trust God's process in my life. There are times where we just can't. And I think that's where Abraham is at. We've been going through the life of Abraham for a while now, and I'm going to continue that this morning. So if you're following along in the YouVersion Bible app, you're going to see that today's event is called Trusting the Process. And at this point in Abraham's life, he's going to learn what that process is. Now, just let me recap Genesis chapter 17 a little bit, since we're picking up in the middle of it. The first thing that we got in Genesis chapter 17 was we got phase 3, right? So we got this result that's going to happen, right? We got God saying that he's going to give Abraham and his descendants land and prosperity and wealth for generations to come, and he's going to be their God through all of it. And then last week, Pastor Dan talked about the first part of the process, circumcision as an initiation and sign into the covenant. But that middle part, it's a big murky mess right now, right? We've got phase 1, circumcision. Phase 2, we don't really know what's going on, but phase 3 is definitely prophet, right? We've got this big murky middle, and that's where God is going to pick up in his conversation with Abraham today. So let's go ahead and start by seeing what God is going to say to Abraham in Genesis chapter 17, starting at verse 15. God says this to Abraham: "As for Sarai your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. I will bless her, and moreover, I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she shall become nations. Kings of peoples shall come from her." So up to this point in Abraham's story, there's been a pretty consistent theme. Abraham and Sarah have not had a child together yet. They haven't. And having an heir would have been really important in the days of Abraham. It wasn't just a way to pass on your wealth. It wasn't just a way to pass on your name. It was a way to pass on your culture and faith and ideals too. And the fact that they don't have one is a big problem. And because of how important that was, I highly doubt it was for a lack of trying between them. And to make matters worse, Sarah is old. Now, if she were here today, I would not say that to her in the room. And I bet Abraham didn't tell her that either. But she was old. We're told in Genesis 18:11 that she was well past the point of menopause. She was unable physically to have children. What's God's response to that? What's God's response to those conditions? Well, God just said they're not going to matter. God just said that's not going to stop his plan from working. And here's why. If you're following along your Connect cards, here's your first fill in the blank this morning. God's promises aren't dependent on our success. God's promises aren't dependent on our success. They just simply aren't. God's power goes far beyond what we could ever ask or imagine in our own situations. God's power and capabilities don't care about Sarah's menopause. They don't care about her infertility before that point. And they also don't care about that little surrogacy adventure they tried to have with Hagar a couple chapters earlier. All God cares about is making sure that his plans are accomplished through the people that he wants them accomplished through. And here that's Abraham and Sarah. And Sarah also gets that name change treatment that Abraham got in the beginning of the chapter, right? Abraham changes his name. God changes Abraham's name from Abram to Abraham, switching from exalted father to father of many nations. And Sarah's name, though the meaning doesn't change, it still means princess. The connotation is very different. It changes that title of princess from being something where she is more Abraham's princess and this family's princess and this tribe or clan's princess, to now she is an archetype for the people of Israel going forward. She's going to be an example throughout generations, and she's going to be the princess of this nation of Israel, this great nation that God is going to bring forth. That's a big transformation of their circumstances, and this wouldn't be the first time that this happened in their life. So let's see how that goes with Abraham's response. In verse 17, Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said to himself, "Shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child?" And Abraham said to God, "Oh, that Ishmael might live before you." So, when looking at this passage before, I've been told by a lot of people, this is Abraham's response is one of doubt. Right? It's one where he sees what God is telling him is going to happen, and he says, there's no way that's going to happen. That's why he laughs. That's why he says these words. But honestly, I can't find myself to agree with that. There's a couple of reasons for this. First off, the first thing Abraham does when he hears this is falls on his face. Right? That posture is an act of submission to God. It's an act of respecting God's will and authority and saying, you do what you want to do. It's a posture of worship and reverence. And Abraham has also seen this happen before in his life, right? Abraham isn't from Canaan. He's from Ur of the Chaldeans, over 1,000 miles away. And by the way he went, it's way more than 1,000 miles away. They did not shoot across that desert. They tried to, follow the river. And God guided Abraham to the right place at the right time every step of the way. And this laughter is also a response to this too, right? Abraham has seen the promises of God fulfilled in his life before, when he didn't understand how they were going to happen. So Abraham's laughter is a response of overwhelming joy, saying, God, I have no clue how you're going to do this, but I know you're gonna. And I'm going to be so blessed by this promise of a child in my life. And the same is true about this plea for Ishmael. This isn't a response of saying, I want Ishmael to supersede the child I'm going to have with Sarah. It's a few things. First, just like the laughter, it's a response saying that Ishmael would be enough for Abraham to see God's promises fulfilled in his life. Right? In the New Testament, we see this story where Jesus is walking down the road and a centurion comes up to him. And the centurion says, Jesus, I have a servant and he's very sick. He's dying. I need you to heal him. And Jesus says, okay, well, I'll follow you to your house. And the centurion says, you don't need to do that. For I understand that you are a man who has authority, because I am a man with authority. I'm a man who, when I tell one of my soldiers go, he goes. When I tell him to stay, he stays. And when I tell him to jump, he just asks, how high, sir, as he revs up for it. Abraham is saying the same thing as that centurion. He's saying, I don't need you to do this overwhelming thing. I don't need you to go through all this effort to do the thing that I know you want to do. Instead, you can just use what I already have. It's not perfect, but you can use it anyway. Now, the second thing that this plea for Ishmael is about is the desire of any parent that's raised their children in a God-honoring household in the ways of God. As John Wesley puts it, it's the desire that these children may live before him. That is, they may be kept in covenant with him and may have grace to walk before him in their uprightness. Abraham still wants Ishmael to be a part of this legacy that he's going to leave. And furthermore, the last thing that this plea is a desire for him not to be completely forgotten by God. I am an oldest child. And that means that at some point, I was no longer the youngest child. That also means I know what it's like to have the cute little things come up behind you and steal that relationship with your parents that you loved so much when you were a child. I know exactly what that's like. That's why I'm really glad my family actually isn't here during this Sunday. That'd be awkward to have to tell my brother and sister I love them and make it feel forced from the stage, wouldn't it? But imagine as a parent, you've raised an only child for 13 years. And you've told them who they are. You've told them that they're going to be an heir to all that you have. And then all of a sudden, that switched. And you were told, no, you're going to have this other child that's going to be the one who's in the covenant. Wouldn't your heart break a little? Wouldn't you feel terrible that the son that you have, though the means to get him weren't ideal, wouldn't you say, I don't want that to be the case. I don't want him to be cast off as like nothing mattered. I don't think Abraham's asking for Ishmael to be the child of the covenant. He's asking for him not to be left as forgotten by God. He's asking for him to not be forsaken. Let's see what God says in response to Abraham here. Starting in verse 19. God said, "No, but Sarah your wife shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his offspring after him. As for Ishmael, though, I have heard you. Behold, I have blessed him and will make him fruitful and multiply him greatly. He shall father 12 princes, and I shall make him into a great nation. But I will still establish my covenant with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this time next year." Here's what we can learn from this, church. Here's your second fill in the blank this morning. God's fulfillment of his promises will always bring him glory. God's fulfillment of his promises will always bring him glory. God doesn't care about what Abraham thinks would be enough. He doesn't care what would give Abraham any kind of honor. He doesn't care about that. He cares what's going to point back to himself. And he cares about what's going to show the world that he can do whatever we think is impossible. And he does that by naming this child Isaac. Isaac in Hebrew means laughter. And I can't help but think that God is saying to Abraham, this child is going to bring you such joy like the announcement of him did. You're going to be so blessed by this child that you're going to laugh about how amazing he is, about the promise that I'm fulfilling to you. And if God sees any wavering in Abraham, he puts it to rest here as well. Ishmael's name means something too. If you remember earlier in Genesis, Hagar cries out to God in the desert and says, "I need you, God. I have nowhere left to go because my mistress is treating me like garbage, and I have been left for dead." And God hears her request. God gives her water and says, "Go back. I'm going to protect you as you go back to Abraham's household." And because of that, Hagar names Ishmael, which means God has heard me. God has heard me. And here, God hears Abraham's plea for Ishmael too. He doesn't make him a child of the covenant, but he does give him a promise of prosperity. He does give him a promise of provision in the future. Here's the next thing we can learn from that this morning, church. Here's your third fill in the blank. Despite our condition, we are given new life through God's promises. Despite our condition, we are given new life through God's promises. You know, Sarah's womb was barren and incapable of producing life. It was dead as far as she was concerned. And now, in a year's time, she's going to bear Isaac, such a blessing that's going to fill her with joy and laughter. It's going to produce life once again. And then there's Ishmael. Ishmael was an heir that was soon going to be without an inheritance. He was an illegitimate child of Abraham's. But now he's been given a promise too. He's been given a promise to provide him with blessings for generations to come. You want some more examples? Okay, let's go throughout Israel's history. Noah, a drunk. God still had him build an ark. Jacob was a liar. Well, not me, but that other guy. But God still used him to be the father of the 12 tribes. And he literally changed his name to be the nation that he was going to build, Israel. His son Joseph was left for dead by his brothers in a well. And then later he was left for dead in prison by his master Potiphar in Egypt. And God didn't care. And he said, and he still elevated him to be the second in command in all of Egypt to preserve both the Egyptians and the family of Jacob, the Israelites, through a deadly famine. Then there's Moses, who had an issue with being the public face of anything. He was meek to a point of fault. He was shy and he did not want to speak in public. And God said, yeah, so you're going to be the face of the movement of my entire nation of millions of people out of Egypt, out of slavery, into the promised land. And his brother Aaron fell into a trap of succumbing to the will of the people. While Moses is up receiving the 10 commandments of God, receiving the Levitical law, receiving a new covenant and a new way to live for the Israelites, now that they've left slavery, Aaron's downstairs at the bottom of the hill, making a golden calf because the people are bored and they think God has left them. Doesn't matter. God still elevates Aaron's name as the predecessor to the Israelite priesthood. One of my favorites is the story of Deborah and Jael. They were women in ancient Israel in the time of the judges. That meant they couldn't lead people. That meant they couldn't do anything for the kingdom of God. That meant they couldn't do the things that God would ask the men to do. Well, one day God decides that he's going to use Deborah. He's going to use Jael to overthrow the oppression of Sisera and his army. And in Jael's case, he's going to tell her, yeah, you're going to go drive a tent peg through his skull while he sleeps. It's a little bit of a different idea of biblical womanhood now, isn't it? You know, Ruth was a foreigner. She was another step in preserving the line of Abraham. And then there's David. David was the weakest of all his brothers. David was tending to the sheep while the other boys were there waiting to be seen by Samuel to see if they were supposed to be God's anointed. He was not supposed to be the king. And God told Samuel, yeah, he's the one. Anoint him. He's going to be the king. And then there's, in the story of David and Goliath, right? David's it'll be a scrawny little boy. And Goliath is very much all the opposite things of that. It doesn't matter. Apparently those little stones are really, really effective. And David, when he's king, is not the greatest from a moral perspective. There's that whole thing with Bathsheba, and there's that whole thing with him killing Bathsheba's husband at the lines of battle to try to cover up his crime. But God still preserves his monarchy through Solomon, the child of David and Bathsheba, the child of that illicit affair. And he still allows Solomon to build the temple. He still allows Solomon to be the wisest person that the world has ever known. Then there's the people of Israel. The people of Israel, over time, stop following all the ways of God. They start worshiping other gods. They start not following the covenant. They start not following the law. They become unaware of the Torah that God gave them. So God says, get out. And the Assyrians and the Babylonians take them out of their land into exile. But even then, at their darkest hour, 80 years later, God brings them back to their homeland to rebuild the city, to rebuild the nation, to rebuild the walls, to continue the legacy of Abraham. You know, John the Baptist was kind of a weird dude. It didn't stop God from using him. Locusts and honey do not sound like a very appetizing diet, but he still uses him. Mary was an unmarried virgin, only a teenager. And then there's Peter, James, John, and Andrew, who were just fishermen. They failed the rabbinical process a long time ago. And when Jesus is walking along the shore of the Sea of Galilee, he says, yeah, you four, you're the ones. You're the ones I'm going to use to build my church. There's Matthew, the tax collector. There's Simon, the anarchist and zealot. All are used to build the church. Even Judas, who betrayed him, was still called to be a disciple of Jesus. Then there's the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul, killer of Christians, persecutor of those who follow Jesus. And Jesus comes to him in a light on the road to Damascus and says, dude, you are persecuting me. I don't know why, but I'm going to blind you for a couple days, and I'm going to give you into the care of one of my own. And you're going to see firsthand the way that people who follow me are treated with unconditional love despite their circumstances. And we're a part of this process too, church. You know, we have our own condition. We have our own faults. We have our own sins that we struggle with. We have our own backgrounds. And yet, God still offers us new life every single day through salvation that's provided in Jesus. He invites us into the way of his kingdom. He invites us into the promises that he has for us. He invites us into holiness because despite our conditions, we are given new life through God's promises. Let's continue on in Genesis chapter 17. Starting at verse 22. When he had finished talking with him, God went up from Abraham. Then Abraham took Ishmael his son and all those born in his house or bought with his money, every male among the men of Abraham's house, and he circumcised the flesh of their foreskins that very day, as God had said to him. Here's what we can learn from that, church. Here's your fourth fill in the blank this morning. Being part of God's kingdom requires some skin in the game. Being part of God's kingdom requires some skin in the game. I mean, for Abraham and Ishmael and all these people, it's a little more like requires some foreskin in the game, but it is what it is. But circumcision was a thing that made Abraham and his descendants stand out from the crowd. A core part of who they was. That's why were and was should never be next to each other in your notes. A core part of who they were was altered to mark them as different. And we have a similar sign too, church. We have the sign of baptism. It functions in somewhat the same way as circumcision. Now, we're not sopping wet all the time. I don't think. Yeah, I'm pretty dry up here. And we don't have like a little rain cloud above us that's always walking with us as we go throughout life. It's making sure that we're continuously wet. But it's still that same outward sign of our hearts being marked by God as those of his children and heirs to his promise of salvation. It's that outward sign of that inward change. And just like circumcision to the Jews had some broader implications, ours does too. As Pastor Dan talked about last week, there was a circumcision of the heart that had to occur. And for the Jewish people, that was Torah, that was law and regulations dictating how they lived as a people under the covenant of circumcision. And just like that, there is a circumcision of the heart that occurs in us too. Because God calls us to a holy life that's different from what we would do on our own. God calls us to have the same mind in us that was in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited for his own gain and own desires and own purposes, but instead emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, being born in human likeness, and being found in human form, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Someone should put that in the Bible, shouldn't they? That's our circumcision of the heart, church. It's emptying ourselves of our own priorities and putting on those of Jesus. Let's close out Genesis chapter 17, verse 24. Abraham was 99 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. Ishmael, his son, was 13 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. And that very day, Abraham and his son Ishmael were circumcised. And all the men of his house, those born in the house, and those bought with money from a foreigner, were circumcised with him. Here's what we can learn from that, church. Here's your last fill in the blank this morning. God's promises are for everyone. God's promises are for everyone. Let's take a look at these people that are in this first account of circumcision in the Jewish faith. Abraham, 99 years old. It's older than Pastor Mark, so we know it's old. I wish he was in the room for when I said that. But Abraham is very advanced in years. He's lived a long life, has been filled with ups and downs and lefts and rights. And God says, you are to do this same thing. You are to obey me. You are to circumcise yourself. You are a part of this covenant too, Abraham. It is not just for those who are in the future. You must obey it now. Then there's Ishmael, his son. On the opposite end of the spectrum, Ishmael's 13. He's a little youngin'. And Ishmael was circumcised too. Doesn't matter how old or young you are. God's promises are for everyone. As the ancient church father John Chrysostom put it, God's grace has no limited span but rather in early years, in middle age, and in the very height of old age, can a person receive this circumcision. Not the work of human hands, which involves not simply endurance, but laying aside sin's burden and finding pardon for the faults of all time. Thus, he is in his provision for our salvation granted us the renewal that comes from the bath of rebirth, talking about baptism, so that by setting aside the former person, that is, evil deeds, and putting on the new, we may advance along the way of virtue. It doesn't matter whether we're young or old, church. It doesn't matter how long we've been at this. God's promises are for everyone. There's a few other people, though, that are mentioned in this passage. All the men of Abraham's house are circumcised too. Both the owning class and the working class are all a part of this covenant. They're all a part of it. It doesn't matter how much money they make. It doesn't matter anything like that. Because God's promises are for everyone, the young, the old, the rich, and the poor. And then on top of that, there are some that were born in the house of Abraham. And I'd like to think that a lot of us are probably these people, right? A lot of us are the ones that are these servants of God that have been born in the house of God, right? I was raised in the church. I am guessing quite a few of us were as well. We've all been on this road for a long time. And God's promise is for them. But it's also for these other people, these people that Abraham bought from outside of his household with the money that he had. He bought them from foreigners. These are Gentiles in the first account of circumcision of the Jewish faith. Gentiles are present and a part of this covenant too. Doesn't matter how experienced we are in the ways of God. It doesn't matter whether we accepted Christ as 3 years old or whether we haven't yet. God's promises are for everyone. The path of holiness is for every one of us to walk, no matter who we are, no matter what our background is, no matter where we've come from. It's for all of us. As the Apostle Paul writes in Galatians chapter 3, there is neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free. There is no male and female. For you are all one in Christ Jesus. We are all unified in Christ. And if you are Christ, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to promise. This is the promise that we all have today, church. This is the promise that God offers all of us. He asks us to cut off the stuff that we're not supposed to have in his presence, and he asks us to follow in his ways.